Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, a treat to be here always. It's been a long time since I actually have been here, and unfortunately you didn't put on a day for golf. But we can't have it all. It's an important, obviously a very important subject, and my subject is also very important. I remember when I was at the NIC the previous time, many long years ago, we appointed John Landry, a very good Army operator, as the National Intelligence Officer for Conventional Forces. Our first lunch John and I had, John said, mused a bit and said, you know, we do these longer term assessments, national intelligence estimates and other assessments, and then at the Pentagon, they're doing all these planning for weapons, organizations, and forces. Why isn't there some connection, he said. Well, it's a good question. I think it remains a good question. We've made some headway at it. I'll come back to that specific synchronization issue in the end. Before that, I'd like to catch you up a little bit on where our premier product and thinking about the future, Global Trends, where it has gone and where it stands. I didn't get to do a Global Trends when I was at the NIC before, but I did play some role in thinking of the idea. And it's worked out, I think, better than any of us expected. There's two dimensions were important to me at the time. If you're thinking about a future longer than a year, none of the stuff on your classified computer screen helps you very much. To do that, you've got to be out there talking to experts, traveling, talking to people in think tanks, on Wall Street, and that is additional incentive for us at the NIC to do what we need to do in any case, since reaching out is our lifeblood across the organization. And Global Trends not only induces us to do that, but bespeaks that we do it. Second, I'd been in Washington long enough to understand that if we were going to get any of our policy counterparts to pay any attention to a longer-term future view, they would do it only if we got some press. So the press was key. It had to be public, and it had to get some press. If it got some press, then the policy folks would turn to their special assistants and say, what the heck is the NIC up to? And that's worked very well indeed. The first one was Global Trends 2015, came out in 2000. As you will have noticed, it now is 2015. So several organizations have, in effect, graded my predecessor's copybook and said, how well did we do? On the whole, the answer is, I think, pretty well. We obviously predicted the rise in the terrorist threat, if not necessarily a particular attack. And in general, it was I think it did a good job of laying out the future. If I were to critique it, and this is something we all care about as we care about methods, it was probably a little bit too much straight line projection. In 2000, globalization looked pretty rosy. It's obviously had lots of good points, but it's also had a powerful underside, and probably my colleagues then were a little bit too optimistic about globalization. My own brush with this I wrote a book about the same time on intelligence, was written before 9/11, came out after 9/11, and I recognized at the last chapter that it was a rather fair weather globalization view of the future of intelligence. I asked myself in the last chapter what might push us to a different path. Well, it wasn't rocket science, but I came up with two scenarios. One was a major terrorist attack on the United States, and the other was a major global recession. Neither rocket science. Unfortunately, we got them both. So the next version of Global Trends on which we're just starting to work will be, I think we'll pay a lot more attention to possibilities that may not be high likelihood, but are very consequential. If we look at the most recent Global Trends 2030, probably it's more like Global Trends 2020, if we're honest, but it does try and reach out. It articulates four megatrends. Probably drivers is a better word. Megatrends may be a little too trendy. Let me just set those out and we can see how we're doing. One talks about an individual empowerment, the rise of the middle class outside Europe, 1 billion people coming to the middle class from the less developed countries, lots of pressure on low-skilled labor around the world. But the empowerment of individuals, we've obviously seen that ranging from the wayward bankers in Paris to Osama bin Laden to Edward Snowden. Second, demographics. In most places, aging and increasing life expectancies. Not true in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. More youthful populations, again, concern about youth bulges and the instability that derives from having lots of young people, particularly young men, without much prospect in a society. Urbanization is part of that, 60% urban by 2030. Fourth is the diffusion of power. That's obviously with us, particularly Asia. By 2030, at least Global Trends predicted, China would be half again bigger than Japan in economic terms, and India would be 16 times Pakistan. Third is sheer population, up growing to 8 billion. Demands for food up 35%, energy 50%, and as we know, increasing source of conflict is that half of the world lives in water-stressed areas. So much for drivers. Then it also articulated game changers. 6 of those. Let me just put those out too and see, make a judgment about how we're doing. One was volatility. It raised the question, were we seeing the breakdown of order, or would we see multiple growth centers with some resilience? So far, I think we'd have to say the breakdown looks more obvious than the centers of resilience. Second, raises the question, would government institutions adapt fast enough, or would they be overwhelmed by social media and all the other changes going on? There again, I think the jury's still out on that one, but governments we know are slow, and lots of other developments in society are fast. That does put increasing pressure on governments. It raises the question, would the changing balance of power, shifts in power, would it lead to conflict, particularly in the context of resource scarcities and in some places of those pools of particularly young men, rather rootless young men? Asked the question whether instability in the Middle East, which it predicted, that's not a hard prediction, right? I think we can mostly get that one right. Asked whether it would spill over into other regions there. I think, again, see some indications of spillover in some places, mostly contained, but the threat of spillover. Fifth, it asked the question, would there be technological changes in time to help with some of the looming problems, with resource scarcities, with the challenges of growing urbanism, or with climate? There, again, we'll see. The challenge of technology, I think, is that we see a breakthrough, or something that looks like a breakthrough, that takes longer to have an effect than we think, because it has to work through all the political, social, and other aspects of society. It may, in the end, if you think about the internet, it may have even more impact than we expected, but it's likely to take a longer time period than we anticipate. And finally, it asks the question about the United States. Would it, particularly given our increasing energy supplies, would it manage to rebound and become by 2030 an engaged, even more important global player? Difficult for us to put the United States central to the analysis, but we're trying hard more and more, since in this world, especially, you can't understand what's going on over there if you don't understand us. The terrorist threat is the obvious one. They're entirely adapting to us, and so to try and understand them without talking about us doesn't make much sense. Well, so much for the past. Here are my working hypotheses. These are more mine than my colleagues. My colleague Dan Flynn will be here for the entire conference, and he'll correct any mistakes I make. These are my working hypotheses for the next edition of Global Trends. It should be Global Trends 2035, but I'm determined not to have a year on it. We've got to figure out some way to brand it without the year, because we've done this every 4 years, reaching out 5, and that means that the time horizon is getting further and further, and therefore more and more fictitious, I think. So it'll be Global Trends something, but contest, suggestions welcome. What goes after Global Trends? Maybe it'll be Global Trends Revisited. I don't know. Anyway, think about it. My hypothesis at first, it seems to me, we talk about world order. Question is, are we in a world of disorder? Is disorder the normal? For me, and this may represent age as much as anything else. But this seems to me to be the third sort of flex point in the last quarter century or more. The first was obviously the fall of communism. The second was 9/11. And this seems to me to be another flex point. The interesting difference in the other two, those other two came or seemed to come with an owner's manual, with instructions. Now, the instructions weren't entirely right, but they weren't entirely wrong either. 9/11's owner's manual said, take a vacation. You've learned it, right? You fought the Cold War for a long time, take a vacation. 9/11 came with the owner's manual that said, get them over there so they don't attack here. In both cases, it seems to me the owner's manual instruction wasn't entirely right, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. This one seems to have no owner's manual attached. It looks chaotic. When I think about the Middle East, it gives me a headache. I said after I've been on the job 2 weeks, and I did an after-dinner speech for a friend's board, and I said, I've tried very hard my entire life to avoid the Middle East. I said, that's over. As the kids would say, that's so over. So volatility is hypothesis number one. Second, questions about whether our values and institutions are being eroded or being attacked. Are liberal Western values in decline? We see evidence of that from Vladimir Putin to the Chinese Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Same question about pluralism. Is the long tradition of pluralism in decline as we see the Middle East carved up in sectarian bits, as we see temptations to live in single culture societies in lots of other places as well? It seems to me it's part of the shapelessness of the world in front of us. We have a funny combination of transnational actors that are still important, ranging from ISIL to George Soros. When the Gates Foundation spends more money on health in sub-Saharan Africa than the World Health Organization, that's a big deal. But that's what's striking is we now have both. We have very important transnational actors interacting in new ways with states, with a kind of rising nationalism we see in different ways in both China and Russia. And that leads to a final hypothesis. Is there a growing, I hate the word governance, it's been used so much it's pretty trite by now, but is there a growing gap? It seems like we see a disconnect between citizens and their governments in lots of parts of the world. It's visible in Europe, pretty visible here. So is that, again, a feature of the world we face? Two others on my list. One is, are we facing a future of slower economic growth than we've had in the past and than we expect? That one I fear I'm fairly confident of, and it does suggest lots of bad possibilities when growth slows down. Lots of problems get harder to handle. We understand, of course, that poverty, the line between poverty and terrorism is hardly direct, but we also know that poverty makes it harder to deal with lots of issues. And finally on my list, maybe of most direct interest here, is we've been through a period in which, in general, conflict declined. Armed conflict around the world declined. That's stopped. It looks like it's reversed. And so the question is, are we facing a future in which there'll be more armed conflict, not less? We've seen the amazing brutality of ISIS, which so far seems to be a recruiting poster, but in the long run ought to be a vulnerability. Still, brutality, all this accompanied with a change in technology, miniaturization, drones everywhere. All of those things make me think that as we think about the future of warfare, it looks more like Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 than some of the things we've seen more recently. But in any case, big hypothesis. One of the things I want the next global trends to focus on is to try and think hard about the changing nature of conflict and warfare. All right, well, against that background, let me turn to the Landry puzzle. How do we try and better synchronize is thinking about strategic futures with defense planning. It strikes me that if you think about the sort of time horizon of defense planning, it runs from weapons. We know weapons today are going to be around for a very long time. Sort of the medium is organization and doctrine, and then plans, shorter run. So no surprise that probably the NIC and organizations like it are most helpful in thinking about broad trends, in thinking about the nature of warfare. When we identified, no surprise, when we identified transnational threats and terrorists as a principal target, that had obvious implications for the military, how it thought about organization, how it thought about ISR to find little things, not big things. So it had big implications, but that's probably the level at which we can be most helpful in thinking about broad trends. What we've done at the NIC through the years is try and translate those trends into ways that are more accessible, more directly useful to the planners. In particular, we've developed over the years a connection to OSD policy to try and take global trends and turn it into work on the future security environment, either technologically or in particular regions. We've also done for them a lot of simulations, try and help get clear about aspects of the future. We've worked fairly closely with the strategic futures folks in the Army at TRADOC. And in 2009, the then undersecretaries, Michelle Flournoy, and my current boss, Jim Clapper, who then Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, agreed that we'd make the Strategic Futures Group at the NIC sort of a focal point for contact between, especially OSD, but other people on the defense planning side, make that the point of contact, and that provides us with the incentive to try and make our work connect. And in general, one of the things I want to do with our global trends exercise is pull it back some or build bridges between a longer-term view of the future and a more proximate set of futures that will be of interest to both the national intelligence officers at the NIC, but especially to their policy counterparts. So we're now doing shorter-term strategic outlooks that look out 6 months or a year, doing those primarily for the NSC staff, but it's something I want to build. Let me conclude with one successful synchronization at the level of plans, which also may suggest something about the unique or at least special attributes of the NIC. When I was at the NIC before, many long years ago, we had a request for a paper on trying to foresee humanitarian emergencies. The main customer was Transcom, that had the sensible view that if it was going to be called upon to haul relief supplies around the world, it might ask where that was going to be, and did they have seaports? Did they have airports? Well, it wasn't all that hard to predict humanitarian emergencies. They tend to be the result of some combination of resource scarcities and conflict, often with the latter causing the former. So we recognized that the expertise on this issue was mostly outside the government. We asked the dozen biggest humanitarian NGOs to join us for a conference. Needless to say, they weren't wild about the idea, right? We were sort of doubly damned. Not only were we government, but even worse, we were intelligence. But in the end, this has stayed with me ever since, in the end, they were swayed because we cared about their issue. We were prepared to listen. And so in the end, they all came to a conference at Meridian House in Washington. They all brought 2-page papers, and in effect, they wrote the opening draft of this estimate. So it seemed to me both a nice way to make intelligence useful to those doing plans in this case, and to, in the process, draw on what I think of as the unusual, if not unique, characteristics of the NIC. Thank you.
There's a microphone. So we're open for questions, ladies and gentlemen. There's a microphone around. Just raise your hand.
Hello. Hi. Malia Dumont from OSD Policy. And first, I'd like to thank you for the great partnership we have with your office. It's really helpful to us.
Great, great.
So my question is about how we posture the intelligence community to make sure that we have the right kind of tradecraft. There are folks like Dan Flynn and your team, but the number of pockets throughout the intel community that are looking at this sort of long-range analysis seems to be pretty small, and in some cases getting smaller. I mean, UCOM is dissolving their strategic foresight team. And I know there are a number of customers that the intel community has, but I'm wondering how, as policymakers, we can help the intel community encourage and nurture the growth of the kind of tradecraft and the kind of shops that can support the long-term strategic thinking that we need to do.
Great question. That's sort of item number one on my agenda, both making sure that at the NIC we fulfill our strategic mission, which is, after all, what I care about, why I came back, but more broadly that the government does have some people doing that kind of thinking. And as you say, it's in relatively short supply. I mean, the good news of the last 15 years is intelligence is much more embedded in the policy process than it was when I was in Washington before. I think that's mostly the result of fighting wars. For better or worse, mostly for worse, you can make policy toward China without intelligence, but you can't fight wars without intelligence. So that embedding is great, but it does mean that the whole intelligence community is really pretty tactical in answering questions. And so trying to build up those pockets of expertise, that's going to be a real challenge, but it is something I think about every day. Somebody the other day put an analogy, which I don't much like, but I'll try it with you. He said, "You're really the Surgeon General of intelligence analysis." And that's about right, I guess. I have not much authority, but maybe what I do have is a bully pulpit. So I don't like thinking of myself as the Surgeon General of analysis, but maybe that's the right way for me to think about it. In any case, I'm going to be cheerleading, pushing, trying to pull in people together on strategic analysis wherever I can. In particular, I'm a constant thorn in the sides of my colleagues in the building where we sit, the CIA building, saying, are you going to make sure you protect strategic analysis, make sure you have some strategic analytic capability. So it's a big challenge, and one that, as I say, is number one for me.
Yes, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. I have a question about the transition of intelligence after September 11th. I think there was a reorganization. I believe the Director of National Intelligence position was established then. And there used to be stovepipes between the various intelligence organizations. They wouldn't necessarily share their secrets with each other. And then after September 11th, they were sharing their secrets. But it seems to me that there could possibly be some advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. Can you tell me how the transition went through that reorganization? What came up?
I wasn't inside the government then, but it was, I mean, part of it was sort of natural. It didn't take a 9/11 panel or a director of national intelligence to make the three-letter agencies understand that in this world of the terrorist threat, they not only could talk to each other, they had to. So in that sense, the communication between, for instance, FBI and CIA, which was terrible to non-existent before 9/11, is really much better. I have FBI people at the NIC. We move around a lot. They're at CTC or NCTC. So in that sense, just the sheer shock of 9/11 got the three-letter agencies to talk among themselves much better. And I think that's a big improvement. Harder to reach out to the other stakeholders, the states and localities, and the private sector, in whose hands all of the infrastructure we care about are. So that's much more of a work in progress. But I think on the whole, that the information sharing at the three-letter agency level is a lot better, and it's good, not bad. As you know, Jim Clapper's main task is to try and promote integration, better integration across the agencies. That's a long-term challenge, and I think, as you say, there may be some limits to how far you'd like to take that challenge, since the agencies do have their particular specialties, and you want them to keep those alive. But I think we're not in any danger of being too integrated. If I worried about that, that would be a high-class worry from where we are now.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. It was, I really appreciate. I have a question about your, I think it was your third or fourth point, about you're suspecting that the global war trends are reversing. And we were at a conference a couple weeks ago and heard a talk with Steven Pinker, who wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he basically looks at those trends. And so I'm wondering what you're measuring it against, because by most of those measures, the standard war measures, I mean, we're exponentially safer than we were today. I mean, millions and millions of people dying in the world wars in the 20th century. You're statistically more likely to fall off a ladder and break your neck trying to change a light bulb than you are exponentially more likely to fall off a ladder and break your neck changing a light bulb than you are in a terrorist attack. So, I mean, that's not very cold comfort to people living in Syria. But when you look at this at a global level and you're thinking the trends reversing on war and conflict, how do you measure that, and what are you worried about?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're absolutely right. After 9/11, I used to always outrage audiences by observing that, with the exception of 9/11 and the wars, they were a lot more likely to be killed by lightning than by a terrorist attack, and that continues to be the case. So this is not primarily danger for the United States, it's danger in the world, and I confess to not having done good metrics. I will do that, but it does seem that in numbers, in some sense in lethality, at least in brutality, if not lethality, things have turned up again. That's what I put that as a hypothesis, one we'll investigate, but it's one that worries me, not primarily directly to us, but in the environment we have to confront. And that does mean then that we'll, as a policy matter, continue to confront more and more cases in which we have to say, do we stand and watch, or do we try and do something about this particular bit of lethal violence? But the metrics, you're right, I got to get the metrics better.
You know, one of the things I am struck by in Washington, D.C., and just coming out of government about a year ago, are the thousands of intelligence professionals in our ranks. I mean, it's a huge number. And often I'm struck by the fact that it's kids' soccer. So, you know, the ball goes in the corner, all the kids run in the corner, all the legs are wiggling. And I had this perspective that there are too many people kicking the ball du jour, whatever it is, whether it's Syria. I mean, and I look at the numbers of analysts we had looking at Syria before 2011. It was a shocking few. And I watched us do the same thing in Iraq as well. Well, we're done there. And so my question is two. Is it because policymakers can't define what the requirements are well enough that prevents you from, you know, appropriately putting the right number of analysts in the near fight, as well as the long-term analysis to help us do a better job of answering the questions that we know the policymakers are ultimately going to ask? So it's a twofold question, I guess.
I suppose the basic problem is that policy people, for understandable reasons, are fixated on the current crises, right? And the amount of questions that come out on those current crises is enormous. To give you some sense of scale, last year the NIC did 700 pieces of paper, of which half were signed memos from a national intelligence officer to Susan Rice or Tony Blinken or an NSC person. There were specific responses to a question, mostly that came out of a deputies committee meeting, where the deputies said, what does the intelligence community think about this, right? And so that stream of questions and answers spreads all across the community, and it's obviously mostly confined to the set of currently hot crises. Now, once in a while, we'll hear from the president or somebody else, what about Asia? More on Asia, please. And that's welcome. But mostly the day-to-day work is so dominated by the current. When I look at I get to read my President's Daily Brief on my little iPad. Though typical in the government, we spend a lot of money on the iPads and an equal amount of money taking all the guts out. So I can't do anything interesting. It's just a reader, right? But it's very, very much focused, as you'd imagine, on the things currently going on. Breaking out of that, the kids stuff, we're trying, and all these things have labels I can't stand, but the label here is global coverage. How can we make sure we're paying attention to places that are important places, but that aren't subject to current crises. And that's a challenge when it comes to thinking about moving resources away from the big four, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Then you do get a serious fight. Terry, you want to?
Yeah, just to follow up, because I sat down with John Landry when I was on the NSC, and we laid out requirements for anticipating upcoming questions that we knew we were going to get asked as part of the policy community deliberations. So my follow-up question, though, is if more of the analytic effort went towards what I would call something other than the crisis, some of those other
Yeah,
because you could see them coming. They're like road markers. You know they're coming.
Yeah.
And so you can see them on the path that you're on if you're in the policy world or whether you're civilian or military. So I'd be interested in your perspective on that. Secondly, would you describe for folks how the senior leaders define where the intelligence focus will be? Because there's a methodology to that that might be worthy of you elaborating a tad bit.
Yeah. On the trying to see if a little bit ahead, I'm always trying to build and look out for mechanisms where we can get some sense for what's on the policy agenda around the corner. So trying to meet occasionally with the Deputy National Security Advisor, working with the policy planners at the various NSC staff, state and defense, again to try and build for us an agenda of things we ought to be thinking about or beginning to work on. It's it's not easy. Policymakers mostly don't know what they're going to do next Tuesday, right? And the current press is enormous. The Deputies Committee meets about some subject virtually every day, including Saturday. And so there's a constant stream of meetings and flow coming out. The seniors have a variety of ways. There's a set of President's intelligence priorities that are meant to come directly from the President and his staff. Then we do the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, which involves, again, some trying to reach out to policymakers. The problem with policymakers is the same thing. They've got a very current focus, and if you ask them, well, what are you going to be interested in tomorrow or the next day, they're not likely to be very articulate about it. So all of these priorities framework exercises are worthy, but hard to do. What we then see is the concrete things that you can't say no to that come out of primarily the Deputies Committee, sometimes the Principals Committee, or other interactions. All very valuable, but that tends to be the work that sort of drives things day to day. Again, back to her question, Mike, so my challenge is to try and make sure we at the NIC, doing those 700 pieces of paper, have some time and energy left to do more strategic work, trying to put pieces together, trying to look around the corner a little bit. It's a continuing challenge.
It appears to me that our current threat, or one of the threats that we've talked about, is this a morphed, ideologically driven terrorist threat. It seems to be a little different than previous terror threats or irregular challenges of international organized crime and so forth. And given the 2 points that you made about a gap between civilians and government gap and the institutional values being under attack, wonder if you could kind of provide your insights into what that should mean for defense planning or capabilities to deal with this ideological threat, given that we have these chinks in our own armor as far as the citizen government gap and the institutions and values being under attack.
It's a good question, to which I don't have a great answer. If you think about at least if I think about the Middle East as a relative newcomer, I've had a steep learning curve. But what strikes me about say ISIL, 2 things. One is, at least in principle, it seems to me there ought to be some self-limiting characteristics. We saw with al-Qaeda that too much killing of innocent Muslims was bad. And that's got to be a factor for ISIL at some point beyond the recruiting poster. Also, they're committed, as you know, to holding territory, and that ain't as easy as it looks, right? So we already see reports of dissatisfaction from people coming out of some of the territories that ISIL holds. That said, it's going to continue to be an ongoing problem. The second thing I guess I'd say is, in a very real sense, it's sort of not our fight. It's really the region's fight. We can't build a moderate Islam, and certainly not with a force of arms. That's got something they've got to work out. So I take as hopeful signs the increasing concerns of the Jordanians, the Saudis, and others to try and put together a coalition, because in the end, this is really their fight, not ours. Once the beheadings started, obviously impossible politically for any administration not to respond, but in a very real sense, it seems to me these problems of the Middle East are theirs to sort out, not ones we can solve for them.
Just to follow up on General Wolf's question, given that resource constraints are always a problem for any kind of process, and that many of the answers that policymakers seek probably don't actually contribute to the definition of outcomes, are there any innovative ways that the intelligence community is thinking about sort of keeping analysts where analysts need to be, but providing an information field that policymakers can use without loading up the precious resources you have that really think strategically?
Oh, it's a really good question. I sometimes say, too bad we can't just say no, right? Sometimes I'm trying to make us say, yes, but, right? So the yes, but is, we often get asked the same question in slightly different forms 2 or 3 or 4 times. And so I hope we can more often say, give the person who asked the paper on point with a paragraph cover that says either our views haven't changed since this was written, or they've changed in a couple ways, and here's how and why they've changed, rather than doing the whole exercise all over again. But when you talk to analysts, then they say, but when they ask the same questions, they don't ask precisely the same question. They're slightly different, and so it's hard not to do it over again. That's and I'm also struck by the differences across agencies. The prevailing ethos at the CIA is that if an analyst is a good analyst, he or she's a good analyst on any subject and can add value to an account fairly quickly. Versus the other extreme is INR at the State Department, where they prize deep expertise. People can stay on an account their whole careers, and they recognize as a result that they can't surge. They can't throw people at a problem the way the CIA can. And so maybe the right approach is to have a mix across agencies. But it was interesting, before I came to this job, I did some work for the Center for Study of Intelligence, looked at intelligence support to policymaking at kind of the senior working level. And those people found it easy. One of the things they said is, I'm happy to be briefed. But many of those people are really experienced, like people in this room. And they said, I'm happy to be briefed, but I really want to talk to an expert. I want to be challenged or validated or taken around the corner. And interestingly, they found those experts more visible at INR than they did at the CIA, even though in numbers there have got to be lots more of them at the CIA, but they're just not so visible and so visibly identified with a particular account.
You talked about super empowered individuals, and like a biological threat to me could be done by just a very small team of people. And I don't know if that keeps you awake at night. It bothers me. And what is the status, given as technology becomes more prevalent, of even the nation states themselves being in existence, when you could have people politically aligned throughout the world with like-minded individuals far away?
Well, I think the nation state is not alive and well, but here to stay for a long period of time, under various sorts of attacks like the one you've mentioned. And we do see, particularly sort of the elites, connected to each other around the world, trying in many places, maybe even including this one, to sort of carve out special arrangements for themselves, not taking over the nation state, not trying to destroy it, but wanting to carve out a special place for themselves in the nation state. So I think that's the trend that's likely to continue, with, in some sense, states being attacked from both the bottom and the top in some ways, but with that, mostly by people that don't want to take it over, but just want to turn in a particular direction or build a special place for themselves. One of my colleagues from outside government talks about the plutocratic insurgency. That's the assault from the top. I rather like that. I probably won't have the nerve to use it, but I do. It does sort of describe the effort by folks around the world to try and carve out special positions and protections for themselves in their respective nation states.
Thank you. Excellency, you raised a question about Islam. And it's a sensitive question because I'm a Muslim and I come from Bangladesh. I'm a retired general. This is in fact creating a lot of tensions all over the world, especially in the Middle East, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. I think Islam is not understood in correct perspective in the Western world. That's what is my feeling. But Islam talks about moderation, everything. There's the directive given in our Quran, our holy scripture, that we must follow a path of moderation, middle path. That's the directive given by our prophet as well. In his last message given to his, we call it ummah, to his nation. Yeah. Now, do you have any program to develop interfaith dialogue or inter-community dialogue, where we can, areas where we find there are similarities between that civilization and this civilization, and then I think a lot of tensions can go away. You will not need the military forces to fight those. And what I feel, the problem is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is again, geopolitics has been superimposed on the religion, and that is creating more tensions. So why don't you control the Saudis that you are capable of doing? And of course, now you are settling scores with Iran, so that's a good point. And why don't you hit the Palestine issue and do something about that? I can assure you, 80% of the terrorist problem will just be wiped out from this planet. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. You've asked me policy questions as well as intelligence ones, so I will duck a teeny bit. I guess on the Islam in general, it seems to me, as I said before, this is primarily a debate and discussion that has to happen within Islam, and how we can contribute. Sometimes we were always searching for moderate Muslims, right? Well, that's plainly not a sensible thing. We're likely to kill people by our embrace. So, not kill them literally, but kill their credibility by our embrace. So there I think the question is, how can we help the Islamic world have the discussion that is essentially its, right? It's not primarily about us. It's primarily about them and their relationship to their religion, their God, and how that translates into action. So there, I guess I think we need to be sort of careful about that. The second thing you were talking about was, remind me, was. Okay. Yeah. 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 Again. Yeah. I guess the other thing I would say is that one of the things that I think is important for us to do as intelligence officers is keep reminding our policy counterparts how other people see us. Right? So whether or not the Palestinian issue is really important in creating terrorists, I don't think we know, but it is interesting, all of the interviews with former jihadis, when asked, why did you do this, U.S. and Western policies are always one of the things they mention. So again, policymakers may treat that with skepticism, but at least it's a set of information that they need to pay attention to one way or the other.